Hi, and welcome to Speechcast, the Essential Public Speaking Podcast. I'm Dave Azer, and I'm so excited that you're joining me for a great episode with a really good friend of mine, Antonio Neves. I've known Antonio for over 20 years, and I'm honored that he's joining me on the show. Antonio is a quadruple threat. He's a television host, he's a keynote speaker, he's got a podcast, and he's the author of 4 books. On TV, he's worked for Nickelodeon, BET, PBS, NBC, and more. As a keynote speaker, he's spoken for Google, Amazon, a whole bunch of colleges across the country. He's got a very successful podcast called The Best Thing, and he is the author of 4 books, including his latest book, Stop Living on Autopilot, which is crushing the charts right now. Antonio is going to talk to you about his experiences on camera, on stage, and as a podcast host and an author. There's tons of great information in the show, so make sure you stick around to hear it all from Antonio. And oh, by the way, you're going to laugh a lot. And before we get to the start of the show, I just want to, again, thank you all for listening and watching. And if you are listening, please subscribe anywhere that you do consume podcasts. And if you are listening on Apple, please also rate and review. That will really help out a lot. And without any further ado, here we go. It's episode 2 of Speechcast.
This is Speechcast, the Essential Public Speaking Podcast. Get ready to own the room with your host, Dave Azer.
Well, it's episode 2, but it's the first episode with a guest. So the very first guest in the history of Speechcast is my good friend, Antonio Neves. And if you're listening on the podcast, you can't truly appreciate Antonio's awesome looking set. But if you're watching the video, you're going, is he in a garage? Is he? What's going on?
This guy's in the garage because sometimes, you know, your kids, they get the preference inside of the house. So my 4-year-old twins, man, they're having that time of the day. So I just decided to retire to the garage. And look, man, I have a sexy 2016 Honda Odyssey minivan behind me. So, you know, I'm living the dream, Dave.
You are rocking your set. You look fantastic. Everything is cool, and I appreciate it. So I'm so excited to be talking to you. We've been friends for so long, and we're going to cover your TV background, your public speaking, your podcast. I'm so excited about this book that you've written, which is doing great. We're going to get to all that. Let's start with TV, because I know a lot of people who I work with, who I coach, aspire to be TV hosts, and you and I have both had the pleasure of doing that for a number of different networks and doing live TV. So let's go back to where you and I first met and started working together, Nickelodeon. I was hosting Slime Time Live. You were one of the hosts on You Pick Live. And for the people who don't know about You Pick Live, which was a huge mega show, recap that show for us. Tell us what it was about.
Yeah, well, even before I recap the show, we're laughing earlier about being in the garage. One thing I learned early on about TV is that on TV looks like one thing, but behind the scenes, it's not glamorous at all. Sometimes it feels like you're in a garage with the minivan behind you, but you got to do the work and you got to show up. You Pick Live was one of the very first shows that actually did like real time, where people could go online and vote for the cartoons, the different shows that they wanted to watch. Like we'd say, hey, today it's Cat Dog versus Doug or whatever happened to be up. And you could go to your computers because folks didn't have phones and they could vote for what show they wanted to watch. It was basically Nickelodeon's version of MTV's Total Request Live. And every single day we had different celebrities come on to pitch whatever they were doing. We did a lot of different sketches, everything we could, just like Slime Time Live, to make sure people didn't turn the channel to Disney or the Cartoon Network. And we had a ragtag group of people, man, and it was a lot of fun.
And for you doing live national TV, I'm wondering if you had any of the same emotions that I had. We were both super young when we were doing this show. We were both in our early 20s. And you know, to be on in millions and millions of homes, what was the process for you like before a show? Were you nervous? Were you memorizing lines? What were you doing to get in the zone?
Yeah, well, like you know, there's a reason why local reporters in the television news start like typically in small markets. They start in the middle of like Idaho or Kansas, and they don't start in like on Nickelodeon on live national television or in big markets. It's because when you start in local news, you start in the small places because you can mess up, right? There's nothing like starting on live TV on Nickelodeon. Unlike you, Dave, I mean, you were like amazing on camera. I always was blown away by you. I was this rare dude that was working for the show that I ended up being a co-host on. So at first I was behind the scenes, man, as a production assistant, holding up cue cards, and some opportunities presented themselves to find my way on camera. And I was ready to make that happen. My process, as much as possible, I don't know if this was a gift or a curse, Dave, because I worked behind the scenes on the show, whether that's getting cue cards together, whether that was prepping the celebrity talent that was coming on, 9 times out of 10, Dave, I didn't have time to prep. I didn't have time to think about it. So in many ways, I think that was a gift because that red light would come on the camera. I would do what I have to do for 30 minutes or a minute 30. But in the back of my brain, sometimes I was like, right after I finish this, I have to run down the hall and go get this prop for the next segment. So I think I had that gift of, juggling so many different things. A lot of the pressure didn't get to me. It makes me even think about, Dave, when I did television commercials in LA back in the day. Sometimes my best auditions were when I knew I was close to getting a ticket on my car because my brain was on can they hurry up so I can go not get a ticket, as opposed to being stressed about being on camera.
Yeah, it's funny. When I auditioned to be on Nickelodeon, even before Slime Time, Nickelodeon Games and Sports, I didn't even know what I was auditioning for. It's a long story. The very short version of it is that I didn't have an appointment for the audition, but I went anyway and begged the casting director to let me read because I knew Nickelodeon was launching a brand new sports show. I was living in Orlando and I thought, oh, cool. I'm going to be on TV. This is in my backyard. I'm going to do this. Didn't have an appointment or an audition. I went and, like I said, just sort of pleaded my case. And to your point, I didn't even know what I was going to be reading in the audition. They handed me a script. I said, yeah, all right, cool. And then I did it. And then she had me do it again and I got the job. So it's funny, for as much as I talk about as a coach, I talk about preparing and rehearsing. To your point, maybe sometimes not over rehearsing is the way to go.
Yeah, well, let me be clear with folks who are listening. I always like to say winging it is easy when you're well prepared.
Right, good.
So what we're talking about here, though, is a little bit, I don't want to call it naivete. I was super busy. I had multiple things going on. So what we're saying is we didn't put a crazy amount of pressure on ourselves, right? Dave walked in, didn't know fully what he was auditioning for. So it wasn't like, oh, no, I'm going to audition for a show that's going to broadcast live to millions of kids every single day. It's like, oh, let me just read this. So it probably came off really casual and natural. Over the years, when I had auditions or readings, let's be clear, 100%, I would prep like nobody's business. Today, as a speaker, I'm still in my garage before talks or in my hotel room practicing getting prepared.
Yeah, when I did my TED Talk, it's a 10-minute talk, and I probably spent, I'm going to say, between 40 and 50 hours of prep and rehearsal and writing and rewriting and auditioning. So to be clear, Antonio and I are both saying you should prepare. It just happens that in these particular cases, we did well without extensive preparation. But I want to go back a bit because I think there's a lot of people listening and watching, at least I hope, it's one of our first episodes, who are saying, Antonio made it on national TV without auditioning to be the host of the show. He was just working on the show and worked his way up. I think that's such a cool story. Do you have advice for someone who's breaking into the business, who wants to be on camera or, the featured host, but isn't there quite yet?
Yeah, well, first I have to give a little bit more information. So yes, okay, he's working on the show, and it wasn't like I just tripped one day while they were live and I was on TV and it all worked out. Prior to the show ever happening, I created a reel and I submitted it to the executives to be considered for the show. 2 years in New York City prior to that, I had taken plenty of acting classes, hosting classes, teleprompter classes, etc. So I had been doing work leading up to that. It wasn't just some random accident. I knew that I wanted to be on camera in some capacity. For folks who are considering entering the game, whether it's on the web, whether it's TV, etc., I want to first and foremost, Dave, ask folks why they want to do it. I think a lot of people enter the television game or the on-camera game, if you will, because they want to be famous. Because they're seeking validation. One thing I know about you is that you're a natural born journalist. You're a storyteller. You're naturally curious. Like this was something that you've wanted to do for a long time. Yes, fame can be a byproduct of that, but your goal in your head wasn't like, let me just go out there and be famous so people like me. So people have to get clear why they're doing this, because the people who do this just to get famous, just to get validated, they don't last very long in my experience. But also, one thing you have to do is study. You have to work hard. A luxury that you and I did not have, Dave, when we were starting out, is it wasn't easy for us just to hit record. I mean, today we all have our own distribution networks. You can go live on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch, whenever you want. That wasn't even remotely possible for us. I remember taking classes and like literally after the class, they'd give you your tape so you can go back home and watch it. And it was on a VHS tape. YouTube didn't exist. So what a luxury that you can hit record on your phone every single day to get better. And let me tell you, it's going to be awkward the first time, the second time, but by the time you get to 365 days of hitting record on yourself, you're going to see progress. And this is something that we definitely could not do on a regular basis early on.
Yeah, honestly, the people who I work with who are younger are so fortunate. They don't know how tough we had it back in the day. There was only a handful of local news stations and then, national cable if you were lucky. Did you have a moment when you were like, oh, I have arrived. I just did something really great on You Pick Live, and I am now officially a TV guy.
I think there are a few moments. I mean, first and foremost, as you know, Dave, it means something really powerful when your family can turn on the TV every single day and see your face, or your friends can see that as well. That feels super amazing. But I think there was a day every now and then you get those compliments from people that come, whether it be the celebs or their team that's with them, et cetera. And they'll say that's a really nice segment, or you did a great job. Those moments were truly, truly special to me. I also was fortunate enough to be a writer on the show. And there are times, Dave, that sure, I got joy being on camera live. And I got just as much joy sometimes knowing the words that I wrote ended up on camera as well. I think for us, I mean, I don't know if people know this. I feel like early on, there was a bit of a rivalry between You Pick Live and Slime Time Live, because you guys were so amazing in the things that you did in Orlando. And we loved your set and all the resources you had. And we were a little bit more scrappy. But I think one of the times we felt like we arrived is when I think we came down to Florida and we all did some work together. Like it was all of us doing something together. We did this in LA as well, I believe. And those are the moments when you're like, wow, look at us all together. This show that I watched on a regular basis, working for the network. And here we are all together. That's cool.
It's news to me. I thought we were all best friends. I didn't know there was a rivalry. Were you guys talking smack about me behind my back? Is the truth going to come out now after 20 years?
No, we never would talk smack around your back, but you guys had this amazing sound stage, and you had this big, beautiful outdoor set, and you had multiple camera operators. And when you came to New York, we were basically existing in a closet.
Look at you now. You're in a garage 20 years later.
Things haven't changed much.
You parlayed your Nickelodeon success. You've had an awesome career, and I'm so proud of you, and I'm so excited to call you a friend. You've done so many great things. We're going to get to your public speaking and your podcast and your book. Let's spend a little more time on TV. After Nickelodeon, you were on BET, PBS. I know there's more as well. Give us some of your highlights, your post-Nickelodeon highlights.
Yeah, well, I made a big transition after working at Nickelodeon, which was one of the best experiences of my life. I decided to transition, and instead of telling stories for kids, I really wanted to get more into stories that were serious, that were for a public good, if you will. And I went to journalism school. I went to grad school at Columbia University to become a journalist. And after that, as you mentioned, I worked for a variety of networks from BET networks. As you mentioned, did a lot of correspondent reporter work with PBS and the NewsHour Online and a program they did for high school students. I hosted a business show that NBC produced. I did that for over 3 years. You see me pop up on E! News Live here and there over the years. And that was just a joy, man, because I'm just a naturally curious kind of person. And being that journalist and get to do those deep dives with men and women blew me away. And what I liked about that is I went from a world that was highly scripted into a world that you didn't know what you were going to get in that story. And I was truly blessed, man, to work with all these networks. When I look at those networks I worked with to this day, man, I'm like, whoa. I really worked with NBC. I really worked with PBS. But I think definitely Nickelodeon laid that foundation.
And I think it's really neat. One of the things I love most about being in broadcasting is that you get to tell stories, and every story can be super diverse and different. So you went from interviewing Adam Sandler for You Pick Live, and then you're covering much harder news. For you, was there joy in that you're sort of every day, you can never mail it in, right? Like you have to be on when you're doing these projects. And I've always loved that about live TV, especially. You cannot mail it in. And for you, all these diverse networks, you had to be on your game all the time.
You're 100% right, man. You can't mail it in. The television industry, if folks don't know, is ridiculously competitive. I mean, if I recall, Dave, I think you hold the record for like never taking a sick day ever.
Well, that was right. Exactly. Because I knew the first time I took a sick day and they brought in a replacement temporary host and the ratings were good, I mean, I get my job back. So
yeah, I'm not giving somebody that opportunity, right? I tell people all the time, all it takes is someone being out sick one day for your opportunity to present itself, right? Have you ever heard of Drew Bledsoe? Remember when he got hurt?
Yeah.
Interesting moment. 100%, man. It's a different skill set going to again, doing the journalism, the serious stuff. There are no off days. However, this goes back to what I mentioned to you earlier about why you decided to pursue this work and why you get into it. Dave, just like you, man, I'm a naturally curious person. I want to learn a lot about people, whether the camera is on or off. I love a fascinating story. I love pulling things out of people. And I've interviewed Grammy and Oscar Award winners, former heads of state, secretaries of state like John Kerry, you name it. And for me, it's not about their title or who they are. It's just them being a human being and being able to have a conversation with them. And there's that moment, as you know, when you're interviewing people, that moment when they're at ease. Like, oh, they shifted from, oh, no, I'm on TV to having a conversation with you. And that feels so good. And even though our brain is like, we're cognizant of that. We're cognizant of how much time we have. We're cognizant of the questions that we need to ask, what we have to get to. It's an amazing moment when you realize the person across from you has forgot that they're on TV.
I think that is so well said. It's such a great point. And for anyone who's listening or watching who wants to be a host, Antonio just nailed it. I really believe that much of the success of the interview is determined before you even ask your first question. If you're interviewing someone who's never been on TV and they're nervous, it's your job as a host to hold their hand metaphorically and make them feel comfortable and let them know that you got them, you got their back. And if that's before the camera starts rolling, just telling them where to look, which camera to look into, or telling them what you're going to ask them as the first question, or just asking them if they have any questions. I think, some hosts who I've seen engage in no small talk and no banter with the guest before the camera rolls and the camera's on and that guest is not ready. They don't feel comfortable. So yeah, I mean, I think that's spot on.
Yeah, I want my guest to win. I feel like my job in many ways is like the point guard on a basketball team or the quarterback on a football field. I'm throwing alley-oops and I'm doing my best to throw you a touchdown. I want to make it as easy for possible for you to win. For me, that means making them feel like an expert. That means throwing a lob, if you will, like that easy underhand pitch, like softball. I've done enough research leading up to that moment. Let's be clear. I'd have never gone into any interview not ridiculously prepared. Even if I know I'm going to have 3 minutes with someone, I am so prepared because you never know what type of connective tissue you may have, what you can bring up prior to the cameras hit record, that you can make them feel at ease. And I've listened to so many of their other interviews that I know the things that'll get them comfortable in talking. And I just want to make them feel like they're an expert.
Yeah, I'm the same as you. I love to over prepare. I'll give you one quick story. I was hosting a morning show in South Florida and it was live. We went to commercial. I went to use the restroom and I walked across the lobby and the governor of Florida at the time happened to be in the lobby because he was doing an interview with the newspaper, the Sun.
Charlie Crist? Was this Charlie?
Charlie Crist. Yeah. And I saw him in the lobby and I was like, I got to go ask this guy if he wants to be on live TV. When am I ever going to see Charlie Crist again? So I went over to him, introduced myself to him, told him I was hosting a show in that room right over there. You want to be on live TV? And he talked to his person and his person talked to his person and they all said yes. Next thing I know, I'm bringing Charlie Crist into the studio. The crew has no idea this is about to happen. I guess maybe in retrospect, I should have asked someone first, but I was the host, whatever. And we've got like now 90 seconds to mic him up. And of course I hadn't prepared for that, but it went well because as a morning show host, part of my job was to be the news guy. So I had a pretty good knowledge of what was going on in South Florida at the time. There was a big thing about the Super Bowl was coming, and it was going to be a great boon for the tourism industry. So I started with that, got that question in, and that led to a second question. And then the director hit me with another question, and it worked out great. And those are the moments, I'm sure you've had them. Those are the live TV moments where, yeah, it's great to be scripted and prepared. But man, when you get one of those off the cuff, on the fly, that's the juice, right? That's the best.
That's the juice. But you also point out something that I think what I've noticed over my career, a lot of people aren't great at. And that is being, I like to call them the Swiss Army knife. If there's one thing Dave Azer can do, if there's one thing that I can do, is I can talk to anyone, whether it's a governor, a professional athlete, the mother who just lost her son to gun violence, a small business owner, you name it. And in the news business, as you know, Dave, you're going from one segment to another. You're pivoting, changing gears so quick, and being able to connect with anyone throughout those transitions. It's an art. It is not for the weary. And I don't think it's appreciated enough. Like sometimes you see general assignment reporter and you're like, oh, just general assignment. Like, no, that man or woman, you don't know over the course of the week how many different subjects they had to tackle and sound like they knew everything about it. It is such an art.
Oh, so well said. And your tone has to change. Your energy has to change. You're going to be different at a funeral than you are at a football game, obviously. So yeah, there's a lot of skills. I think much like a referee or an umpire, if a host does a really good job, you don't notice them, and that sometimes is a pretty big compliment. They're just getting it done. And like you said earlier, and like I actually said in my book, I use the point guard example too. Your role is to just be a point guard. You're going to score. There's plenty of points to go around, but you obviously want them to look great. All right, let's move towards your keynote speaking. You are such an accomplished speaker. Google, Amazon, Stanford, et cetera, et cetera. You've mastered the TV set and on camera. You move towards stage speaking. What was that transition like?
Oh man, it's an aggressive transition. Just because you can stand in a studio and do live TV or even taped TV is very different than walking to a room, whether it's 100 people, 300 people, or even like 5,000 plus people that I've been able to give public talks to. It was a very harsh transition early on. I was so used to doing a minute story, 90 seconds. Every now and then I'd work on a show that was like a half an hour, but those are all just segments. Dave, as you know, giving 10 minutes, just to give a 10-minute talk, 10 minutes is a long time. I don't think people realize how long 10 minutes is. When I realized I had to do like 60-minute talks, which is the standard keynote when you go into a company or an organization, early on, I struggled in doing that. One, being able to weave a story, find the ebbs and flows. This is the one right here, being able to adjust in real time when you realize something is not working. Early on, I couldn't do that. Like I had, this is my talk and this is, I'm gonna get from point A to point Z, but you learn so much over the years. A lot of my talks early on, Dave, I bombed. They didn't go well. Maybe one of the gifts that I had, going back to what we talked about earlier, why reporters start typically in small markets, is when I started doing public speaking, most of that was on college campuses. So I went to colleges all across the country that you never heard of. And so for a year or two, I was learning in real time. I was like a comedian in small comedy clubs, getting, they're getting their energy, getting their reps, if you will. So I was fortunate enough to speak at a lot of colleges early on before I hit some of those really big stages. Can you give us an example of something that didn't work? One time you bombed, maybe a joke that didn't land or a speech that just wasn't happening? Well, I can tell you a couple of things. One, there's a moment when you're a public speaker, when you realize if you're a pro or an amateur. And that moment is when you're somewhere and you're on a stage and the technology dies, the PowerPoint dies, the computer, something dies, and it's not coming back on, and you're only 12 minutes into a 60-minute talk. Can you still finish the talk? Can you juggle? Can you still finish the talk without using your PowerPoint slides as a reference point? Because early on, I used my slides as a guide to lead me on my road where I'm going. Without them, I was lost. Now I use slides just to accentuate a point. They're not my guide. I may end up skipping 5 of my slides during a course of 60 minutes, depending upon where it goes. But early on, even my college days, Dave, my college agency called me and said, hey, last minute, somebody canceled. There's a big event in Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh. It's over 3,000 people. Do you think you can do it? And I'm like, absolutely, I can do it.
Right. Just always just say yes and then figure it out later.
Say yes, figure it out later. Let's just say 2 minutes into that talk, I said, this is about to be the longest 58 minutes left that I have in my life. It went horrible, Dave.
Why? What happened?
Because I didn't know how to handle 3,000 people yet. I could talk to a room, but not 3,000 people. The talk I had was more of a workshop as opposed to a keynote. There weren't really any stories in there. But what messed me up, Dave, is after I finished, I got this big round of applause and a big standing ovation. And I was like, maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. But I found out they're required to give everyone a standing ovation at the end. So it wasn't me. I got out of that place as fast as I could. That's one of the rare talks when I was like, I kind of wanted to decline payment because it didn't go good.
That's hilarious that you get a standing O and then later on, oh yeah, no, that's just a courtesy standing O.
Just a courtesy standing O.
But those are the best lessons. I have made so many mistakes on TV, on set, on stage. But it's fine. It's okay. As long as it's not a career ender, that's the best way to learn.
That's where the magic happens. I like to think about anything. It's kind of like driving a stick shift. If you've ever driven a stick shift, people love being in 5th gear where you're going fast. But I find you got to learn to love the process. 1st gear, 2nd gear, 3rd gear. But the magic actually happens during the stalls when things don't go your way. That's why live TV is so amazing, because when somebody cancels all of a sudden, or that teleprompter goes down, or breaking news come in, you kind of find out what you're made of. And just briefly, so you heard about the bad ones. A few years back, I was doing a big talk in DC, a big event. I was actually emceeing it. And I remember going, and one of the speakers was the vice president of the United States. And I remember going backstage for a break, and the executive producer came up to me, Dave, and said, hey, just so you know, the vice president is running late. We're going to need you to stall for a while. And so I'm like, cool, okay. And I said, how long do you need me to stall for? The executive producer looked at me with so serious, Dave, and said, for as long as you can. And I was like, oh, this is in front of 6,000 people. I was emceeing. I was reading a teleprompter. I was interviewing people. I had turned off all of my stories. And it's like in real time, I had to reboot my computer in my head, the keynote speaker. And I went out there and it was okay. But here's the difference. The difference. When that happened, Dave, and I'm sure you've experienced this in your work, because of experience, I didn't freak out.
Yeah.
I actually was kind of excited. I was like, oh, okay.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's see what happens. What a different energy. A few years back, I would have been like, oh, SHI, But this time I was like, okay, let's see what the kid can do. What a different energy.
And it went well enough.
Oh, it went great. It was totally fine. It wasn't as long as I thought it was going to be. It ended up totally working out.
I had a similar experience. I'm pretty sure you were there. So I was hosting Slime Time for Nickelodeon, and they asked me to host the orange carpet, the red carpet, if you will, for the Kids' Choice Awards out in LA. So I went out to LA. You were there, right? For that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, right. You were there. And so it was live. And the idea was, much as they do with the Oscars, I'm hosting the pre-show, and then the pre-show is going to end. It's going to go right up to the start of the Kids' Choice Awards hosted by Rosie O'Donnell. So I'm outside, I'm on the carpet. I finished my last celebrity interview. Don't remember who it was with. And now I'm reading the teleprompter as the camera operator is walking backwards to this stage. We would go inside, right? And I'm like walking to this stage and I'm reading the prompter and we're T-minus 30, T-minus 20. I'm about to throw to Rosie, national TV. Here we go. And I get in my ear, Phil. Yeah, right. And just like your point, I am out of teleprompter. There is nothing else to read except for here's Rosie O'Donnell. That's like the only thing left. And it's just Phil. And It's so funny. What you just said is exactly how I felt. I wasn't even nervous. I was like, this is cool. This is an opportunity for me to shine. Let's see what the kid can do. And I, in real time, just was like, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to get the crowd hyped by asking them if they're excited to see all of the musical acts, right? Like, who's excited for the Backstreet Boys? Because it was a live audience, and the crowd's going nuts. Who's excited for Christina Aguilera? And I did enough of those where they're like, okay, throw to Rosie. And I threw it to her, and it worked out great. So those
stakes, let's be clear, those stakes for you were ridiculously high. Walking into Pauley Pavilion, it probably was, and it was just jam-packed. I mean, those are high stakes. Not to get too insider baseball with Nickelodeon, I thought you were going to say the clock stoppers thing you had to do in Orlando, which was a really big deal. You remember that movie Clock Stoppers?
Yeah,
was a live thing?
I do, but man, I do remember doing something, but what was it? Do you remember?
There was some kind of big thing Paramount and Nickelodeon were doing for Clock Stoppers. I think there was a big sweepstakes or something like this, and you were going live, I think, on Nickelodeon and maybe CBS or something. I don't know. And there was the specific things that had to happen like within 90 seconds. There was no margin for error, no room for a mess up. I remember being in New York City and all the executives watching on the television. And that bad boy, that TV went live. They said your name, that jib swooped in. And you just gave a most ridiculous, amazing 90 seconds. And I just remember hearing people just cheering, so happy that things went great. And it was like, that dude is smooth.
That's a great lesson, though, because if any aspiring hosts are watching and they're thinking, oh, man, I'm going to be on national TV. I'm so nervous. Hey, 20 years from now, you won't even remember it.
20 years from now, you won't. I see clips of me every now and then of so many different things. I'm like, whoa, when was that?
Right. Is that really, did I do that? Because I get a lot of Slime Time questions, like what was your favorite episode? Who was your favorite guest? And like, hey, do you remember the one time when you did this? And I'm like, yeah, sure. But I don't.
No idea.
No idea. All right. So let's see. We've covered a lot of your on-camera stuff. We've covered some public speaking stuff. Let's talk about your podcast. I love your podcast. One of the things about you that I have always loved is you're just so funny. You're just one of those guys that just makes people laugh all the time. And that's a rare gift, because you have this sort of like understated humor where you're like Modern Family. You don't try, you just sort of bury the punchlines. And while your podcast has plenty of serious kernels in there, there's some good natured stuff too. I'm a huge fan. Tell our audience about it.
Yeah, the Best Thing podcast. I talk to people about the quote unquote best thing to happen to them that would rarely appear on a resume, bio, or come up in conversation. And the amazing thing about this podcast, Dave, as you know, as a listener, is that most times the best thing that people share, when it was happening, it was not the best thing, but it had a profound impact on their life and who they are today. So I just love doing that. But the backstory to that is after so many years of public speaking, 8+ years of public speaking on stages, I realized all the conversations I was having were two people. I was speaking to audiences, and I desperately missed having fascinating conversations with fascinating people. So I decided to do what we kind of invited people to do at the beginning of our conversation, to hit record on myself. The technology, everything to do this is pretty easy nowadays. And so I decided to kind of bet on me and just hit record. And I've been so blessed to have over 50 plus conversations up to now, slowly but surely, a year in, to be clear, starting to hit the charts in the US and definitely on some global places. But it's one of those things that I would be doing, Dave, even if we weren't hitting the charts, even if I wasn't getting any big listeners, because it just brings me so much joy. So I want to remind people who are listening to this that, you always, I'll do that when I get a sponsor, or I'll do that. No, if it brings you joy, if you love it, do it. And that's why I do it, man. I walk away from every conversation so fired up.
Yeah, that's my impetus for doing this show. Same as you. Whatever happens with it, happens with it. It's an opportunity for me to talk about the stuff I love. One of the things about what you and I get to do is that it's such a rush. Performing it's just an awesome thing. And I just encourage anyone who is even mildly curious about what it's like to be on stage or on set, just like you said, just press record. Because when you get the feedback from your family, from your friends, from a guest, which is awesome. When a guest is like, hey man, that was a great interview. Great job. Thank you. those moments jazz you up so much, and you can't wait to get at it the next day. Have you had? I know you have, but on your podcast, have you done an interview and the guest is super appreciative and the listeners are super appreciative and just makes you feel really blessed to be doing it?
Yeah, well, I've learned a few things. I mean, first, you bring up a great point. Like, it feels so good when you get that feedback. One thing people should know is that don't always expect the feedback as well. We put so much pressure on ourselves, like to press publish on a video on YouTube or a podcast, and guess what? 9 times out of 10, no one's gonna watch it. So we put all this pressure on ourselves, and most times no one even watches it, which is funny. However, over the course of doing this podcast, I have received so many amazing notes, reviews. From the guests who say this podcast is like no other. You're asking me questions that I never get to answer, things that make me think, because normally people talking about their background, it's all chronological. It's the resume kind of conversation. What are you here to promote? But I actually let them be human. That's what I like about this podcast, is human. Another thing that I learned too, man, this was early on, and I didn't take offense to it, is like, if you do interview someone, don't always expect them to promote it either. I think that was one of the biggest misnomers. I assume that if you come on my podcast, or I have you on, or I write an article about you as a journalist, that you're going to share with your community. And that's not always the case. And I say all of that, Dave, because I'm not going to share this podcast with my community.
Because that was my next question. Yeah. Well, I don't have to air it. Right now it's just two people talking.
Well, I, of course, will definitely share this. But if you've heard anything throughout this conversation with Dave and I, yes, we know each other, but we're having fun, right? Yes, Dave's prepared, I'm prepared, but we're having fun. And you can have the same kind of fun with a stranger. If you build that right rapport, you bring the right energy, you show the same preparation, you can have the same level of fun.
Larry King recently passed, and I think, and I'd love to hear your take, what made him so great is he was just curious. And I love that about him. And it sounds like, duh, he's a host. Of course, he should be curious. Not all hosts are. Not all hosts ask a lot of questions or seem interested or actually are interested when the other person is talking. He didn't ask the most brilliant questions. I say a lot when I coach hosts, not every question has to win an Emmy. Sometimes you can just ask a 5-word question. And I think Larry King was so good at that. He was just like, tell me more about that. Or why'd you make that decision? Right? So sometimes it's just that, I don't know, that willingness to want to learn more. It makes a huge difference.
That curiosity, that directness. There's an art, especially early on when you're beginning. It's being able to ask a question before you run out of breath. If it takes multiple breaths to get your questions out, odds are it is too long. Again, this is especially for people who are just starting out. Probably means you haven't prepared. And in TV, you don't have a lot of time. And so you want to give that airspace to the person across from you. And Larry King was absolutely brilliant at that. A lot of hosts, I think, want to just come across as super intellectual. They want to seem really, really, really smart. But when you make your guests look smart, you end up looking smart. Yeah, I think Larry King was amazing to watch, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes he just ask a question, and you're like, yes, thank you for asking that. That's
what
I wanted to know.
It makes me laugh too, because there are sometimes I'd listen to some of his interviews early on, and I'd laugh too because he had his direct questions he would ask. But every now and then there were moments when somebody would reveal something really heavy, like they'll say something like, "Oh, and that's when I ended up living in a shelter." And then his next question would be, "So you're from Cleveland?"
Well, that's not good. Right?
So the point that first, Larry King can do whatever he wants because he's a genius and he was brilliant at what he did. And, you always got to be present. You always got to be present and tune in, because if you're so focused on your next question, you can miss something amazing that the person said.
That's great. That reminds me so much of a lot of red carpet reporters. And a lot of these red carpet reporters, no disrespect to them, no disrespect at all. But a lot of times they give those gigs to people who are not hosts. They're reality TV stars. They're, pseudo celebs, whatever. And they give them a mic and they say, go interview Tom Hanks, go interview Meryl Streep. And they do exactly what you're saying. They've got their card with 5 questions. Who are you excited to see? Who made your dress? whatever. And every now and again, they'll get like a really good kernel, something fun, and they just miss it. And they just go to question number 4. Those are great shoes.
And you're like, you just missed the most amazing opportunity to follow up on that, man. And we see that so often, so much. And not to lament and complain, but if there's something that does break my heart about where we are now when it comes to broadcasting and hosting, Dave, it kind of breaks my heart when you see so many celebrities getting into the hosting thing. Because you were part of this. You saw the industry shift when it went from quote unquote professional host to all of a sudden celebrities started hosting these shows on televisions. It reminded me of like when film actors all of a sudden started doing TV, right? They started taking big time film actors started taking the jobs from the TV actors. I'm even seeing nowadays, like a lot of podcasts. Now there's like these famous people. Now they have their own podcasts. And if anything brings me any joy, I'm not going to say this person's name, but this is this person that I love as an actor. And this person has a new podcast. And I was like, oh, I love this person as an actor. I'm going to listen to this podcast. And this person is the worst host ever, the worst question asker ever. I'm not going to say the person's name. In a way, it brought me joy to know that I'm a better question asker than this person. But it also made me realize like this person is exceptional in this area. It doesn't necessarily mean you should be doing something else as well just because the zeitgeist has moved over there. Now, that may sound like a hater a little bit.
Not at all.
But it shows me how much a unique skill set it is.
Yeah, no, you don't sound like a hater because I totally agree. And it bugs me when people think, oh, I could be a host. Because I get that sometimes. People will reach out to me and say, I want to be a host. Okay, cool. Have you done any broadcasting? No, but I like to talk and I'm an actor. I can do it. Okay, but what are you going to do when your teleprompter crashes? What are you going to do when your guest gives you 2-word answers or doesn't want to answer a question or is in a really bad mood and is really difficult? What are you going to do when your co-host is in a bad mood and your co-host isn't prepared and you essentially have to carry the load for 2 people? There's a lot, what are you going to do when your director's talking in your earpiece while you are live, while your guest is simultaneously talking to you, while the stage manager is giving you time cues that keep changing? So hosting is hard, and for people who are like, yeah, I can do it. I can talk. No.
I can have my own podcast. I encourage you to try it. Don't get me wrong. Just don't expect to be great at it right away. And just briefly, I still remember interviewing David Spade on one of those orange carpets for the Kids' Choice Awards many years ago. And I remember just saying, David Spade, tell me, what's different about the Kids' Choice Awards compared to other award shows? And he says, absolutely nothing. And I was just stumped. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't a pro back then. But right, what are you going to do in those moments? So again, I don't want to sound like I'm a hater. What I'm really trying to get across is what a special skill set it takes, and it's just an art.
Absolutely, and it's attainable. If you put the work in, you can be great at it, and it's a great feeling. Like we've said a couple of times, to really crush a segment or an interview or a teleprompter read. It's awesome. I want to talk about your books. You've written multiple books, and the one that you have out now, Stop Living on Autopilot. Man, I'm following you on social every day. You're like celebrating another success of this book. I'm so proud of you. Tell us about it.
Stop Living on Autopilot, Take Responsibility for Your Life and Rediscover a Bolder, Happier You. This is a book for people who have technically checked off all the boxes that society told them to check off, whether it relates to the education, their career, maybe marriage, maybe having kids, but they still feel like something is missing and something is off, and they want to reconnect to their purpose. They want to be bold and courageous as they once were. This is something that I experienced myself back in 2016. On paper, Dave, everything was looking good, but some things weren't clicking in my life. And one of the things I realized was I stopped being optimistic. I stopped being bold. I stopped being courageous. I think back to when I first moved to New York City in the year 2000, Dave, with less than $1,000 in my bank account. And that hustle that I had, that good attitude that I had to break into the industry and make some things happen. And a lot of that zest for life had disappeared. So a question I really pose to people in this book is, what have you stopped doing that got you to where you are today? Those things that got it. That's why the Best Thing podcast exists right now. The book really is about, I want to say, you're a sports fan, you'll appreciate this. It always blows my mind when you're watching a football game and it's halftime and one team is winning, say, 30-0. And then they come back after halftime and it's the fourth quarter and it's 2 minutes to go, Dave. And that 30-0 lead is now 30-27. And so what happened? That team that was playing to win in the first half, all of a sudden they came out in the second half and they were playing not to lose. And as you know, Dave, there's a different energy in sports and a different energy in life of playing to win and playing not to lose. I had reached a point in life, Dave, where I was playing not to lose. It always baffles me, but I know it too well that when these amazing men and women I work with, when they get titles like director or vice president or senior vice president, it's amazing. They get these corner offices and then they stop doing the things that got them to where they are because they get afraid and they don't want to get fired and they don't want to lose it. So this book is about helping people continue to play to win as opposed to play not to lose.
Man, that's so great. It's so inspiring, man. I'm so proud of you, and I'm so glad that you wrote that. And I think to bring it all full circle, that advice is certainly applicable to performing, to being on stage, to being on TV. If you've gotten to a point where you can give the same keynote in your sleep, challenge yourself. Don't give the same keynote. Change something. I always tell people when they're reading teleprompters, you can very easily switch to autopilot when reading a teleprompter. Challenge yourself so you don't do that. Change a word on the fly. Use some vocal inflection. Whatever it is that you're doing, don't just mail it in.
I agree 100%. And for the folks that are listening to this, it may sound cool today to say that this book came out with a major publishing house. What I want people to know is that before this book ever happened with Penguin Random House, I self-published 3 books, right? Self-publishing 3 books led to this. So this goes back to what we talked about earlier, being willing to write your scripts, being willing to press record, whether it's on your camera, whether it's on your phone or your computer, being willing to go live and just putting yourself out there and see what happens. You're going to feel raw. It's going to feel naked. You're not going to like how you look or how you sound. And that's okay. What you're doing is slowly but surely betting on yourself. And when you hit record, the next day is going to be a little bit more easier and you're building confidence. And what we're talking about is being willing to create your own momentum. If there's something I lament, look at me using big words today. And when I say lament, Dave, but I don't think the opportunities were there early enough for us, is how long the work that I did for so long, I only would do if I was picked by a network or if I was picked by a sponsor, right? I'll do this only if I get a sponsor. But nowadays, you don't need that. Again, we all have the distribution network at our hands. So be willing to endorse yourself.
Yeah, if you don't, nobody else will. And again, that's how I ended up on Nickelodeon in the first place. I didn't even have an audition, but I just wouldn't take no for an answer. Look at you when you were working on UPick. You weren't on camera in the beginning, but you wouldn't take no for an answer. And now 20 years later, with all your success, you're doing this podcast from your garage. So,
I knew you were going to say that. I just knew you were going to say that. I love it. Oh, man, I was going to say it too. So, and see, even Dave right there, I don't know if people have heard the nuance in this conversation. We're friends having a conversation, but in our brains, we're leading somewhere that can lead to a laugh. You've thrown me some lobs where I can easily pick up the conversation. So folks who are listening, go back and listen to this slowly and just notice how we're kind of setting each other up and how the brain is working. It's not random. It's intentional.
It's been so fun, man. And now I'm new to this podcasting game. This is, again, the second episode of this show, but really the first with a guest. The first episode was like, hi, I'm Dave. Stay tuned for more episodes. So this is really kind of the first episode. Any advice for me as I embark upon a career as a podcaster? And part 2 of that is, what's the protocol for having people back? Am I allowed to have you back on, or do you never come back again? How does that work?
That's funny. Well, first and foremost, let me just applaud you for being willing to hit record, to be willing to endorse yourself, not knowing where this is going to go. That's amazing. Most people won't do that. So I'm excited you're doing this. You're a pro. In terms of advice that I have for you, no. If anything, I'd ask you to give me some advice. I think, if Dave's not having fun, something's wrong. That's going to be your beep, 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 beep. Something is off when you find yourself not having fun. You get to do this from home. You have an amazing kid behind those walls there. So my only challenge for you is to make sure you do this and you always have fun. Even, of course, you're going to have some serious conversations with people as well. but that's going to be your metric of success. Hopefully you walk away more energized after these talks as opposed to depleted. In terms of having, it's funny. The podcast industry is interesting. A lot of folks won't have you on twice. You can have me on as much as you want. I will come on every other week if you like. I'm going to find a reel of us, by the way, doing Bleacher Bloggers when I guest hosted that one day.
Wow. Yeah. That's another one. Yeah. That was a web show that I did out of my apartment in New York City with Brent Popolizio, who was Antonio's co-host on You Pick Live, and Antonio jumped in and filled in. We've done a lot of stuff together, my friend.
I just forgot about that. I just remember coming out to LA. You couldn't make the meeting, and I had to pitch a show that you and I created, and I pitched it to this major magazine. And I was so happy after I pitched it, and the guy said, "No, thank you." Like literally, I don't know why I just thought about that. Like, no, thank you. I was like, okay. Forgot about your new
downer. Was that DigiDish?
Yes, DigiDish. Yeah, DigiDish.
Antonio and I created a project that
I forgot about your amazing apartment in New York. I love that place, man.
Yeah, New York City was fun, dude. So awesome talking to you. Tell everyone how they can find you, get your book, listen to your podcast. The floor is yours.
Everything for me is at theantonioneves.com. I promise you one day the guy in Brazil who has antonioneves.com is going to forget to renew, and I have the automation set up to get it. But for now, it's theantonioneves.com.
Which I think is even cooler than antonioneves.com.
I know, right? Like, I'm still mad that I can't get my own name. I mean, it's not like, are you daveazer.co? No, you got .com, I'm sure.
I don't know if there's another Dave Azer on earth. But thanks so much for joining me and for being my first ever guest on this podcast. It means a lot to me. And we'll talk. I don't know. We'll talk in an hour. I'll call you. We'll talk about it. Thanks for
everything. See you soon.
All right. Thanks again to Antonio, and thanks again to you for listening and watching. If you want to learn more about me, just go to my website, daveazer.com, and please subscribe to this podcast. Tell your friends about it. And if you're listening to it on Apple Podcasts, please also leave us a rating and a review. I would really appreciate it. We'll talk to you again next week.